Today we're going to learn how do we send transactional emails from our Babbel application using loops. And loops, if you haven't heard of them, is a really interesting player, kind of this ecosystem of email service providers. You might have heard of like MailChimp or Postmark, SendGrid, MailerSend. Loops is a new player, but quickly becoming the favorite of a lot of startups because they're really, really simple to use. And they're also just as powerful. So today we're going to learn how do we actually send transactional emails from our Babbel application. We're going to learn about what exactly that is to send a transactional email versus other types of emails. We're going to learn how do we integrate with the API and how do we use that to be able to send a template that we've created within the Loops interface, plug in some dynamic data, and then have some kind of trigger that sends that email from our Babbel application. Let's dive in. Okay, first things first, this tutorial is about sending transactional emails with loops. So what exactly do we mean by a transactional email? As it turns out, there's two different types of emails to consider when you're considering emails on behalf of your business or your service. There's transactional and then there's marketing. It's very important that we understand the distinction between the two because there's legal implications as well as sort of logistical implications for mixing them up. So transactional to start with, this is any kind of email that you would reasonably expect as part of using a service. So things like reset password or, often welcome emails considered as part of transactional, or things like, your subscription has expired, right? Any type of email that you couldn't really expect the service to function without this. This is why actually welcome emails is kind of a gray area. And I'll link to an interesting article in the description for this video about welcome emails, because you could say that you don't really need to send a welcome email to a user for them to actually use your service. Whereas you could say that, hey, reset password, you need to be able to send an email to a user, giving them some pathway for resetting their password, because there's no other way really to connect with that user to get them to do that, right? Like outside of the application, which they need to be logged in, authenticated in order to do stuff. Outside of that environment, all you have is their email. You're not going to come knocking on their door and asking them to provide some photo ID. All you have is their email. So unless you can use an email to be able to reset their password, they're going to be locked out of their account. Unless you can use their email to notify them that their subscription has expired, okay, then you can't really give them that information any other way aside from within the application itself. So those would be reasonable scenarios for sending an email and thus totally valid as transactional. Gray area for welcome emails. If you're promoting things within a welcome email, then it's probably a bit dubious. But if you're just saying, hey, this is how the application works, you've now got an account, like it's more sort of informational and functional, then you might be okay. But this is definitely not legal advice, okay? So those are transactional emails, right? The important thing with a transactional email is if this is your app here, okay? There's going to be some trigger within your application that then sends an email right, that then sends an email to a user, okay? So it's sort of a one-to-one relationship most of the time, not necessarily, but usually there's some trigger and then you're going to send an email out, okay? You might say that, there's going to be some cases where you might bulk email users in a transactional context. That might be to tell people that, your service is going to be out of action for the next few hours, or you're aware of the bug and you're treating it, or everyone needs to, agree to your new terms and conditions. There are those scenarios, but most of the time there's some scenario, some sort of trigger event, and then your app is going to facilitate sending that email to the user. Now, marketing emails are different, okay? Marketing emails include things like, our Black Friday discount is now live. They include things like newsletters, okay? They're any promotional message, basically, right? Anything that's not central to the functioning of the application, like transactional, you would classify as a marketing email. And You may have heard of things like GDPR, right? These are broad regulations that are designed to stop internet companies from blasting customers, or blasting anyone really, blasting users of the internet with promotional material that they didn't agree to receive. I mean, that's just one of the use cases, okay? So one of the key things, and my stance on this is try to be abreast of the most sort of restrictive regulation that there is. And I'm no legal expert, but one of the important things with GDPR, which is the general, the General Data Protection Regulation, maybe, which encompasses Europe, and the UK also has their own version. There's from regulation in California, which is quite similar. Long story short, like, the GDPR is quite a restrictive regulation. It applies to users in Europe, even if your company is based in another country. So my stance is that if you're making sure that you're compliant with a restrictive regulation like that, well, then any other jurisdiction that you might be operating in, which may have less restrictive regulations, you're probably going to be okay with. And the core piece, one of the core pieces of GDPR is making sure that you get consent from your users to send them this kind of emails. They have to explicitly opt in, right? You have to show the user something like this. Keep in touch, tick this box if you would like to hear about our upcoming news and events. Like, the user has to explicitly check that box to tell you, yes, I want you to send me these kind of emails, okay? So that's one of the really important distinctions to keep in mind with marketing emails. Now, regardless of what type of email that you're sending, okay, when you want to send one or more emails to one or more users from your application, you're going to use an external email service to do so, okay? So the external email service, right, like Loops, who we're talking about here, but you may have also heard about SendGrid, Postmark, MailerSend, MailerLite, which is just for marketing emails. All of these different services, you can think of them like the equivalent of sort of the post office, or like Royal Mail or DHL, any kind of like delivery, postal delivery service, in that what they have is basically, or what they give you access to the email network, okay, which you can think about in analogous terms to, like the postal network. Just like when you want to deliver a parcel to somebody, right, you're going to give your parcel to DHL, whoever it is. In the same way, you're going to give your email to the external email service provider like Loops, and then they have basically the integration with the email network to be able to deliver that email/parcel, right, to some other recipient somewhere else in the network. And you don't need to know how this network operates. Okay, they are the ones that are going to handle or facilitate the sending of the asset, the sending of the resource to somebody else. And all you have to do is basically give them information about what that email has inside of it, right? Which, of course, yes, is the contents, but it's also the recipient, okay, the subject, and if anyone is CC'd, like anything that these guys, the external email service, would use in the sending of that email, okay? So you're going to pass all of that information to the external service provider. With marketing emails, you don't necessarily need to trigger the sending of those emails from your application. You could just as easily like log in to the external email service provider, like MailChimp is a good example here, right? They give you an interface where you can actually craft your email, right? You can add different text blocks, and by the way, I'm using a tool called Mobbin here to show you this, which is a really handy UX tool, which I'll link to below. So this kind of portal that they give you is another place where you can go and send a marketing email. And oftentimes what's critical or important or sort of part of the service here is that they're going to be sending that email, which might be a marketing email, to a lot of different users, right? They don't necessarily even need to be users of an application. They could just be contacts that you have in an email list, right? That you've built up with consent over time, and you're just going to send out a blast to them, okay? You might be able to trigger the sending of a marketing email from your application, but that's not necessarily the case. And more often than not, you're going into something like Loops or MailChimp and you're crafting a marketing email to send out. So marketing emails with loops is something that we're going to cover in a different video. Today, we're just talking about transactional emails because that's really the important one that you need in order to get, your MVP or your first version of your application out the door. And what we're building, we've got a really simple sign-up form. All we're going to do is hook up a action to fire off a welcome email to a user. And remembering this, right, we're not going to send a welcome email that is promotional. It's just going to be functional. It's just going to say, hey, you've got an account and now you can access all the stuff. Cool. So that's what we're going to build. Now for sending our emails, we're going to go with loops because for a lot of you guys who are watching this, that are solo founders or makers or small teams, like loops is going to be your best bet because, well, they can do the marketing emails, which you probably want to explore, as well as the transactional, which we're talking about today, but they just provide a really straightforward, simple experience for getting that off the ground. The API is really simple to use. They've got an editor within the service where you can write your emails, write your templates, inject them with dynamic data. So this is, in my opinion, just going to be the most straightforward option for you. So we'll go through here just creating our loops account because I think that might be helpful for a bunch of you folks who are watching this now. Obviously, the experience might change in future, and then we'll get into the meat of the video. Right, first step of this form, I'm just going to call out something here that a bunch of you guys might find interesting, which is that you can add a plus sign and then some arbitrary string and then the rest of your email. And this will be ignored whenever an email is actually sent. Right, I'm still going to receive it at this email here, but I can just put this in so that I can kind of use my actual email address for multiple accounts with the same service. You can do this with your Bubble app as well when you're locking in new users. Okay, your next step was a confirm your email step, which I've just done. And now we actually have to get into setting up your domain. So I want to walk you through this part here. So I've got basically a placeholder domain here with a name sheet, which is a place where you can buy and manage domains. So I'm going to pop that in, and Loops actually recommends that we set up a subdomain, which means having this sort of little preceding part before our domain actually starts. So I'm going to follow their advice. I'm going to do that, and then we just add in our company address. Okay, and this is sort of the boring part where we have to set up basically a relationship between the domain registrar for our domain and loops. Now, this step is relatively boring and technical, and I'd be lying if I told you that I understood exactly what was going on here, but we don't really need to because it's just a matter really of copying information from here and pasting it into our domain registrar, as it's called, which in my case is Namecheap. And at a high level, all this is doing, all that information is doing is basically allowing Namecheap to update the public record, so to speak, of our domain here with this information that creates a relationship with loops so that emails that we send actually come from our domain. So I'm going to go through this process for Namecheap here because it might be useful to actually see it being done. And for you, if you're not with Namecheap, it's more or less going to be exactly the same process. So within Namecheap, I'm within here, advanced DNS. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to look for what the type is. So the type of DNS record, as it's called. And I'm going to copy this value envelope.hey. And I'm going to add a new record of that type text. The value for host here is going to be that text that I just copied. And then the value of the record itself is going to be over here. Okay. And I'm just going to go through that for all of these. So this is a CNAME record, has a slightly different function. So I'm going to go and I'm going to look for a CNAME record, paste in that value, and then paste in the value for this record. So this is the name, this is the value. Well, this is the host field, okay? And when you do that, at least in Namecheap, it removes the other records that were there. So I'm just going to go through and do that now for all of these. And then for this MX record, it's sort of slightly different, lives in a slightly different part of, at least for Namecheap, the dashboard. So we're going to go under mail settings, and I'm going to change this to custom MX. And this is where I'm going to paste in here this this envelope.hey value, okay? And this is essentially the address for, on behalf of Loops, for where emails from our domain are actually going to come from. And then we've got a priority 10 that I'm also going to plug in here. Again, it would be lying if I told you exactly, if I knew exactly how all this was working, but if I did, I'd probably just go and start a company like Loops. So better that I'm doing this. This will take a little bit of time, okay? So this can take a few hours to, to a day. So we're going to come back to this later. Now, once you are verified, you're going to see something like this, okay? So this is perfect for us. And then you'll be inside of your Loops account. Now, for transactional emails, we've got a section over here called Transactional. And how this works is we're essentially going to create, if we go up here to new, we're going to create a new email template here that we're going to trigger the sending of from our application. And we're going to be able to pass dynamic data into there as well. Now, if you've worked with any email providers before, some of them enable you to be able to completely write a custom HTML email body, or a plain text email body for that matter, and just use the email provider, the email service like Loops here, as sort of a relay, right? You're just going to pass in a message and who you want to send it to, and they're just going to then send it to the recipient. Now, this is slightly different in that what we're going to provide to Loops is basically a template ID. It's going to be an identifier that Loops can use to identify one or more templates that we've already pre-configured within our Loops account, right? So this might be template 1, template 2, template 3. And as we're going to see, some of the other things that we can pass in here are dynamic data, which might include things, like the user's name, for example. So we can say in the email, "Hi, Matt," right? So that's what we're doing here in Loops. We're creating a new template, essentially. Okay, so if this is our welcome email, then we might say something like, "Hey there," we'll do it without dynamic variables for now. "Welcome to our awesome app. Make sure to do these things first," right? The email editor here is pretty straightforward to use. If you've used Google Docs or Word Docs, Notion, anything really, you will know exactly how this works, okay? And then we could add something like a button, access your account here. This button won't be hooked up right now because we need to actually pass in the URL that we need to direct users to, but nonetheless, you get the idea. Okay, you can preview this if you want. You can set up all kind of the different sort of default styles, whether that's a particular font or whatever it might be. Okay, and then all I'm going to do is I'm going to hit next, and then there it is. There's my template ID. Loops actually calls it a transactional ID. So there's the ID that we know that we're going to need to send through. And if I click here, show payload, we're going to see a little bit of information that we're going to use in order to set up this API call. Okay, so what we essentially now need to do is we need to set up an API integration with Loops. So if we actually go into this documentation here, this is the API documentation for Loops, which is obviously always very handy to read. We should definitely learn about how we're going to authenticate. But just first, right, if we go down to send a transactional email, okay, what any good API docs will give you is the structure of the request as curl, okay, in the format that's required for curl, which is just a command line protocol essentially for interacting with web services. So I'm just gonna copy this, and if you're using the basis extension, we'll shortly be rolling out an update that just allows you to copy and paste this entire API call from the extension into your app. You don't need to set it up manually like this. But either way, it's pretty easy to do. We just have to create a new API, and then we're just going to import a call from curl. So I'm just going to paste in that curl body import, and that's going to create everything that we need. So a little bit of just cleanup. Firstly, is this default API call that was created when we created the entire kind of API bundle here. I'm just going to remove that, and we're going to call this what it is: send transactional email. In fact, that's a lie. This is not a sort of multi-purpose API call. This is just for sending welcome emails, which has its pros and cons, but one of the pros is that it's very, very quick and easy for us to set this up. One of the cons is that any time that we need to send a new template, we have to set up a new call. But once we have the structure set up for one, it's fairly trivial to set them up for others. So that speed of getting set up is really actually a feature of loops rather than some kind of cost. So this is actually going to be send welcome email. Okay. Now we're just going to ignore the body for now. We're going to get to that. But with any API call, the first thing that we want to do is make sure that we are authenticating properly. And I wouldn't even bother looking at this. I'd go straight back to the documentation and I would go, okay, so how on earth do we authenticate? And it looks like they're using very common structure. They're going to give us an API token and we're going to pass that in the header of this API call using this authorization header. So when we copy that curl body, okay, it automatically extracted the header that we need here. However, we want to, as much as we can, always make use of Bubble's built-in authentication handling. So for this one, because we're using a private key in the header, that's what this token represents, and that's what the documentation here is telling us. We're using an API key in the header. That's how we're going to authenticate ourselves with this API. We want to make use of this private key in header. And the reason why we want to do that is because Bubble then gives us an input for adding the development key and a live key, which allows us to kind of separate those environments so we can do all of our testing that appears or that is related to kind of one API key, and then all of our live stuff is related to another. So we'll just set up the developer one, the development environment here. We'll say Beera, and we'll remove this. And then what we'll do, and this is actually a bug with Bubble right now, which we'll address in a second. We want to follow the instructions, which is going into our loops dashboard and finding our API key or generating an API key. So it's under settings, API keys, okay? So we'll call this our Bubble app dev, right? And what we could do is create a new one for our Bubble app live once we're at that point, okay? So we're going to copy this and I'm just going to paste that in here as so. Now the other thing that we're going to do is just change over this content type. That's just a standard header that is used over HTTP requests, essentially over internet-based requests, that tells the receiving service what the structure is of the content of that request, the content in this case of this API call, which is JSON. So this is the standard way of doing that. I'm just going to move this header outside of this individual call. I'm just going to make it a shared header for all calls up here and then delete that down there. And the reason that I do that is if I want to add more calls under loops, they're all going to use the same content type, right? So rather than having to add in content type to the headers that are unique to each individual call, I'm just going to do it here once, and Bubble is going to insert that header into every single call that we do on behalf of loops. So now we come down to the interesting part, which is the JSON body. And this actually we can remove, because this is, again, one of the nice little things that loops gives us, is if we go back to the our transactional email that we created and we go show payload, okay, this is all we need to add, right? This is all we need to add here, is this payload here. They've generated it very kindly for us. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste that in, and I'm just going to do a couple of things. So I actually want to replace this email value using Bubble's own syntax for dynamic values, right? That's going to allow us to define this dynamically, right? So we can send it to different types of users. And then the other thing is for this transactional ID, I actually want to make that a dynamic value as well, but I'm going to mark that as private. Now, without going into too much detail, essentially any information that we have in here is publicly accessible. Bubble will actually expose this structure. Now, by marking this private, that says that, hey, this information isn't going to be exposed in that public information, okay? So anything sensitive that we're using within API keys, we always want to mark them as private here. Actually, I'll put it within recipient email where it should be under transactional ID. So we don't want the recipient email to be private. And then we just need to initialize this, okay? So I'm just going to add in my own email here. And if we've done everything correctly, which we haven't, then we get an email. And that's telling me, oh, I actually forgot to publish that email template. So I actually have to go up here, back into loops, hit publish, okay? And I should just be able to go into view metrics and kind of wait now. If I reinitialize this, or reattempt to initialize it, this time it was successful, and there is the email that I sent within my dashboard, which is great. And then if we go into our email box, right, here's the email, wonderful. Now what we want to do is set this up so that we can pass in dynamic data, right? So that we can actually say, hey, to the user's actual name, we can have a link, a URL here that actually takes the user to the corresponding part of our application. And then the last thing to do is actually hook this up within our bubble logic. So we send the welcome email when a user actually signs up, which is kind of the easy part. So I'm just back here within the email template, and actually I'm going to rename this to something more appropriate. I'm going to hit edit as draft, which will create a draft mode version of this email template for us to work with. So really, it's quite simple to add dynamic data. We just need to add placeholders that we're going to plug data into, right? In the same way that you might have a text element in your bubble editor that you're going to plug in some dynamic data like current user's name, okay? Exactly the same way, we're going to create a little window here that we can push data through essentially. So this is the way that we do it. We're going to hit insert data variable and we'll call it something here. We'll call this the user's name. Okay, and the other place that we want to add a dynamic bit of data is here on this button. And the way to do that is we'll click on make sure that we're clicked on the button. We'll hit here, add insert link, and then we'll hit that insert data variable button, and we'll just call this button URL. By the way, I'm using here something called camel case convention, where the first letter in a phrase is lowercase, and then all the rest are capitalized as so, right? Because one of the important things is that our data variables here can't have spaces in them. Okay, so I think that will do for now. So if I go over here to next, and if I go up here and click republish, I will want to confirm this. Yep, those are the data variables that we created. Something's happening. Boom. Now we've got a couple of data variables appearing here. I'm going to hit show payload, and you'll see that the payload here is slightly different. Okay, so we've got this new section here called data variables. So I'm just going to copy that bit. Okay, not the rest. I'm just going to copy that bit, because if I copy all the rest, it's going to overwrite. It's going to overwrite kind of this lovely bubble dynamic data feature. So I just want to copy just that last bit, which can be a little bit frustrating because things aren't indented quite how I would like, but I think we'll live with it. And then because this is a JSON body, one of the things about JSON bodies is that each attribute in the JSON body needs to be separated by a comma. So technically, this, and this are all data attributes listed one after the other. So we need to insert a comma now here after the email one. And then within data variables, this is what's called an object within JSON. And we've got these two guys here where we can now add in the value that we want to publish. If I was to copy this whole body, you would see, I'll put it here underneath, right, how it kind of should be structured. And I guess what I could do, I could just grab this or I could just grab this and just paste that in. I guess this would be another way of doing it. Paste this in as so. and then I'll just remove this. But you can see that there's the comma that we needed to add. This guy needs a comma after it as well. So yeah, this is probably a little bit easier to work with, apart from the annoying lack of indentation here. And then this is where we can now add in our dynamic data, right? So this is going to be the users. I can't use a comma, sorry, users name and apostrophe, I should say. And then for the button URL, we need to give that a name within this convention here as well. Looks like we've got a little bug there. So I'm going to fix it by just playing around a little bit, to be honest. Okay, Bubble seems to be okay with that. So let's add in some placeholder values here to test with. So Matt, and we can just make this as so. These don't need to be private, remember, because these guys actually we want to put through dynamically. So I'm going to initialize this, and that turns out to be a successful initialization. And if I check my emails, okay, that part looks like it's good. And if I open this in a new window, that's working fine as well, clicking on the button. So that's awesome. Okay, so really the last thing for us to do is to hook this up with our app logic, right? So I'm going to make sure that I'm going to use this as an action because I want to fire it as part of a workflow. And then I've got within my group sign up, I've got a create button. If I go into the workflow for that, I've got an action to sign the user up. And then after that, I'm going to find my new API call, which should be under loops, send a welcome email. Wonderful. And this is where now I could say, basically I've just signed the user up. So I could grab the current user's full name, although I feel slightly better about just grabbing it from the input because then I don't have to do any kind of network requests or assume that Bubble is not going to do them for me. So I'm going to grab the input full names value, which, as you might expect, is that guy there. And then the button URL, we'll just can leave that as it is. That's the sort of thing that you might want to save in an option set so that you can access it readily. And the recipient email, again, probably that input email signups value is the way to go there. Now, one little thing is that we might want to account for a scenario where the user hasn't given a value for this full name value, right? I can say, yeah, we don't have to give it, right? Let's make that optional, right? And in that scenario, right, the user might not have given a value here. So in that case, within loops, they don't at the moment provide kind of like a fallback value. So we have to give them that ourselves. So what I could do here is just use this defaulting to operator and could just say defaulting to there, like, hey there, instead of hey Matt or hey Josh or hey whoever, right? So let's try that out. I'll just add in a value here and I'll give again, basically an example. What I like to do is just kind of give an abbreviation of the date. So this is the 9th of January. Let's hit create account, check our emails. All right, that one looked like it came through fine and well. And if I just test again, without giving a value for the name. So in these kind of testing scenarios, right, I might just add a button with a workflow to log the user out, just so I can quickly kind of test something very quickly, because I know that I'm logged in now as that other user. Okay, so now I'm going to leave this blank. I'm going to add in a different email, try this again. And now it's showing up as, hey there. So that's sending transactional emails with loops in a nutshell. Again, loops is definitely the one that I recommend for probably the vast majority of you, just because of its ease of use, the fact that you've got these transactional emails and your marketing emails all under one roof. If you need something more sophisticated, you do have options like Postmark and MailerSend, but I'm hoping that loops is going to be the best fit for a lot of you kind of founder, maker, Bubble tinkerer crowd. So if that was helpful, please give us a like, give us a subscribe, leave some comments below if you've got any questions. Otherwise, happy bubbling.